Harriet, Charlene.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. And we're very excited to be here with Bob Eckstein talking about his book about museums called, wait a minute, I'm going to pull it up so I want to say the right thing. Footnotes from the most fascinating museums, stories and memorable moments from people who love museums. And for all of you here, of course, you fit that you fit that criteria. So we'll be hearing all about Bob's book in just a minute, but I did want to say a couple things. One is to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming, and to thank Bob for letting us share this program with other libraries who jumped on the chance to be in on it because they knew that their patrons would just get such a kick out of this conversation. You can buy signed books by Bob from Aesop's Fable, and I'll put that link in the chat. And if you have questions for Bob, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat, because I will not be able to follow it as fast as it goes through. So Bob Eckstein, what should we say about him? Oh my gosh, he wrote this book. So we were just talking about how his books have been blurbed by Michael Palin, from Monty Python, and Steve Martin, but also like the former CEO of Atlas Obscura. He is just known by everybody, and his books are fantastic. He's written The Illustrated History of the Snowman. I mean, who doesn't want to read that book? And the one that I love, maybe not the most because I love this one a lot, is The Complete Book of Cat Names that your cat won't answer to anyways. So you can tell this is going to be funny and engaging and interesting and all about everything we want to hear about museums. So Bob, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's great to be here. Thanks everyone for showing up. This is really great. I want everyone to grab a cup of tea or coffee and relax. Just going to have a fun session here.
Great. So yes, we are going to do a slideshow and we're going to see some wonderful pictures. As I said, Zoom has been giving me a hard time, so I'm back. And Bob, have you been here the whole time?
I have, and if something happens, we want everyone to know not to panic. If it happens, just be patient, and we'll just reconvene.
Yes. So
and keep our fingers crossed. Yeah.
So as I said, Bob's going to be doing a screen share and some slides. But first, Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself. I did like the stuff that I was fascinated with in your bio.
Oh, well, I do a little of everything. I do some teaching. I speak at different events. I talk about cartoons. I talk about writing. I talk about all sorts of things. And ever since I was a teenager, I was writing. I was a columnist for my local paper, the New York Newsday on Long Island. And then I also did illustrations. I was teaching early on. And then I pivoted over to doing some cartoons. And I'm going to share some tonight because I know some people know some of my cartoons. So we're going to intersperse some of the stories I'm going to tell with some cartoons. We're going to talk about museums. And I really want to welcome everyone to ask me questions about any of these subjects, cartooning or publishing. If you're a writer and you want to get started, or if you're in the business, I would love to discuss any questions if you have them. But we're also going to do museums. I'm going to spotlight some of the special museums during this hour. But if you have any museum questions, and even if it's not a museum I discussed tonight, feel free to ask me about it, because I sort of became a museum expert in the last 2 years as I traveled around the country, talking to curators and people who worked in museums, talking about what it was like to be in a museum. And they were telling me their best stories. And I collected hundreds of stories and chose the best in the book. In the same way, I had to narrow down which museums were going to be in the book. But let's go to the keynote, because I have a lot of fun visuals. And again, if you have some questions, put them not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And if it's specific to an image or something, we'll see if we can jump in and address it. And if not, we'll get it at the end of the talk.
I think I'm about to click out again. Yep.
Great. Okay, great. So we have another problem. Just let me know and we'll pick it up. Great. So my latest book is right here. The schedule again will be that I'm going to go into all these different stories about myself and the museums, bouncing around. And I want to share with you how I made the book, some of the inside baseball stories, and also how I work creatively, what I do to write jokes, and how I make the cartoons. So let's start off with a local museum. This is the Sleeper McCain House up in Gloucester. And a typical way I would start is taking lots of photographs and talking to people and just soaking in the beauty of this place. And this is actually a national landmark up there. It's this amazing house that was built by someone who was a celebrity in those days, who wanted to make this special house. He was building it out piece by piece, and it's the great details that make it so great. Here's an example of me capturing one of the great details. And what I do in my work is simplify everything and just try to accentuate what's important. So a lot of what I do is taking things out and just including what's the essence, what's most important to give that feeling. And as you can see, here's an example where the way I would illustrate is very simple lines. If you look at the horizon line, for instance, my painting style is very minimalistic, trying to capture it to look right, but not to overdo it.
Bob, can you repeat the name of the museum that you were just talking about?
That's the Sleeper McCain House.
Oh, yes. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And it's up by the coast. It's north of Boston. And I'm going to share this cartoon because I'm going to do that throughout the whole evening. Just jump in with some cartoons, squeeze them in. But let's get back to the house. And let's go inside the Sleeper House, which is maybe the most amazing house I've ever been in. As a matter of fact, I was so inspired after I went to this house that not only did I want to do illustrations of it, but I wanted to reconfigure my own house and take some of the things that I saw and put it in my own house. And I did just that. I went home and I have some secret passages in my home. This one, the staircase, has a trap door at the top of the stairs. This is now my house. So I'm just going to share some inside stuff, and this is where I work. It leads to my office, which is what you're seeing me work in right now and talk to you. It was actually voted one of the top coolest offices in the world, in the top 10, and it was written up in Macworld magazine. And it's been in magazines and it's been featured on TV. And I have this style that I call low tide, which is I put different electronics and stuff in these old pieces of wood and stuff to camouflage it. And this was all because I was going to write a book on Sir John Franklin, who went missing when he was looking for the Northwest Passage, a shortcut to get over to China. And I decided to write a graphic novel that's in the form of a diary from 1850. And I thought what I had to do first was to get in the mood and reconfigure my attic to look like the inside of a ship. Also, it was a great excuse to procrastinate and put off doing my book. But here we have like a trapdoor in the back here on the left, right here, and that's one of the secret passages. This was once the attic, but that's now my office right now. And this is a part of that book. This is the way I would work. I would sort of doodle and I think of different ideas, and different symbolism would represent some greater concepts to what I'm going to try to say in the story. So let's get back though to the museums. This is an amazing kitchen where it looks over the water. Can't see it quite through the windows, but this is the water it looks out to, and there's the squirrel again. So what I would do is I would just taking in the whole thing for a day and then be inspired and do sketches. And then I came up with this drawing. This is in the book. I'm not going to read verbatim from the book. What I'll do is I'm going to just share my stories in my own words. I feel like there's a special relationship that a person has with the physical book and reading it on their own. And I don't want to ruin that if you do get the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paraphrase what this story was about and all the stories going forward. in this case, this was a surprising bachelor, which they called someone who was gay. And in this case, the owner of this house had a crush with his next door neighbor, a Senator Andrew Piatt. On the other side of his house was another neighbor who he was fighting with. And that neighbor was upset because the owner of the house, Henry Sleeper, which the house is named after, Henry Sleeper is his full name. And he was featured in magazines, and he was doing all these different things because he was a well-known socialite. So his other neighbor who was mad at him was mad because this house was ever expanding, and it was getting closer and closer to the neighbor, to the point that there was a spite wall built between the two homes. And that's a spite wall is when you build a wall that overlooks the house next door. First of all, there was a bee in the car. So I'm going to add things about myself, and I'm going to add that everything that's happened to me has been by accident and is reflected in my cartoons, whether it's what I do for a living or even how I met my wife. It's all reflected in these cartoons, and it's all been kind of a crazy accident. And so this was based on real life. Bees could be very funny when it's someone else. One of the museums in the book is the Columbus Museum of Fine Arts. And what happened to them once was that they were doing an installation for the spring, and they had real flowers and real floral setups. And this one artist decided that it was a good idea to use real bees. And of course, I think everyone would guess what's going to happen is that the bees got loose. The person who was one of the top people at the museum is allergic to bees. And things got worse before they got better. The artist was so apologetic and felt so bad about this incident that cleared out the museum and had everyone evacuate, that they came back the next day with these lollipops that were made of honey. And that was even worse because all these lollipops were dripping on the artwork throughout the museum, and that was even more a catastrophe. Now, this museum was not too thrilled that I used this story. Initially, it was told to me by a curator, but their boss, when they saw the book, was not too happy that of all the stories I chose for this museum, it was that one. But when I was doing the picking of any story for the book, it was always the most sensational, the most interesting story. And a lot of stories involve accidents or different things that happen in museums that you wouldn't expect. And in this case, well, the bees didn't go over too big with the people who ran the museum. So what they did was they asked me to stop printing the book. But we didn't do that. We came out with the stories we wanted to come out with. And as you could see between this piece and this piece, how much more the piece comes to life with these stories. That's the whole point of what I do with my work, is I try to marry my artwork with these stories and let other people kind of take the stage and actually take a back seat and just provide sort of background music to the story. Is there any other questions before I move on?
Nothing pressing.
Okay. I wonder if anyone knows where this is. This is another museum of mine that's like a favorite. Massachusetts has the most amount of museums per square mile, and it has my favorite museums, and this is one of them. And this is Mass MoCA on the northern corner. And one of the most amazing parts of this museum is a building that just houses the work of Anselm Kiefer, a German artist. And he created these enormous canvases that sort of are inspired by poetry and reflect his views toward war. These are all sort of interpretations of submarines. And here's some other examples. And this is just simply one of those moments where I was so moved, and I would go home so inspired. I couldn't wait to get to work illustrating this museum. And this is the exterior view that has a spaceship that supposedly, according to the installation artist, has crashed onto Mass Mocha. And it has a whole story with it, but it also has a puzzle. The artist has made a hidden message somewhere on the roof of the building using the solar panels. And this puzzle is still unsolved today. A person who is one of the people in charge has worked there for years, still hasn't figured out what this puzzle is. And this is my interpretation. What I want to do again is simplify and make the viewer feel like it's really a painting, and you could see the paint moving around and you could see the lines right there. But at the same time, it does capture the essence and the feeling and look of the museum. And so this, yeah, it's still missing. I'll throw in this one cartoon of mine, which is, I think some people would know it. This is a cartoon that is very popular in other parts of the world. And I try to make all my cartoons, when I can, mean something that could mean something more than one thing, and not have a caption. By having no caption, it leaves it more open to interpretation for that personal viewer to interpret what it means. This is the Boston Bar, and it's the location for the Museum of Bad Art. And this was my interpretation of that photo. Use the photo, and then I try to take it from there to make it sexy and exciting, and a destination you want to go to. And the Museum of Bad Art is a great example of what a museum could be. A lot of people think of museums as just fine art and academic, but it can be so much fun. It can mean anything. There's a spam museum, there's a Noah's Ark museum, there's a museum for great cars. One museum I went to in LA, the museum had a James Bond collection. So I feel like there's something for everybody. In this case, this is one of their worst pieces. Instead of a highlight, this would be a low light for the museum. And it's even, I guess you could say it's a museum for people who hate art. And there's a fine line between bad art and hoarding. This is a cartoon I did. Unfortunately, is something that many of us are all too familiar with, is inheriting things that we didn't ask for, or problems we didn't ask for. That this is another cartoon on the same theme. Some say museums are just hoarders, but I'll get into what I think of museums later. But one of the first hoarders could be claimed to be Isabella Gardner Stewart. That's another museum that's not very far away from you. And she was one of the first hoarders. This is a little watercolor from the courtroom. And inside is one of the great stories in the art world, which is, it's the most expensive, biggest art heist in history, when the Rembrandts was stolen from the Gardner Museum. Now, these frames stay empty today because she placed in her will a condition that nothing is to change in the house. So after the paintings were stolen, they could not replace them. And this is a mystery that's still up for grabs now, with a $10 million reward. If anybody watching here is retired maybe and has some free time, if you want to check that out. Speaking of things that were missing, I threw this cartoon in. Sometimes my cartoons would be used as payment. There was a stretch in which I was not making much money at all for my art. It just simply wasn't, the sort of thing that anybody was getting much money for cartoons and stuff. And I would sometimes trade payment with a cartoon. And I would place my doctor in some of my cartoons. I have an example of that later, where I would pay him for an MRI or some procedure with a cartoon because he was in it. Now, this is a story from the Boston Fine Arts Museum. Um, Actually, technically, they call it the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And it's the opposite, in which they found a painting inside another painting. They had a painting of a Van Gogh from 1952, but recently, with special technology, they were able to X-ray this painting, and they found another painting underneath it. And doesn't look like anything. And if you go to the museum itself, it looks like even less than anything in person. I kind of gave it a little bit of a life here. It's sort of like a gray mess, but underneath the X-rays is a Van Gogh masterpiece. Also in the museum is the Sargent paintings, which people go to the museum just to see some of his classics. And this being one of the most famous, in which he has a painting here in which the two vases on the side of it, which the family traveled with everywhere they went, are painted inside the painting in between. This was a royal family, Edward Darley Buet, I think that's how it's pronounced. And they would bring these vases everywhere they went, which made no sense. But he captured the dynamics between the daughters reacting to each other in this setting. And for this painting, I had my wife sit down on the couch, and she's in the book now. And I'm going to speak about my wife now just for a second, because she was a big influence for me. We knew each other in college. And like everyone in college, you have these mortal enemies, and we were enemies. But we ran into each other again 12 years later. It wasn't actually a class reunion like this cartoon shows. It was actually at a funeral. And the caption for this is, well, this is awkward. It was at a funeral that we ran into each other. We sat next to each other, and we kind of said, well, this might as well happen. And what we did was we actually eloped to here off the coast of Iceland. And I sent postcards back to my family to let them know that we got married. She's been a big influence in my whole career, encouraging me to get into books. When I first met her, I was doing illustrations and I was teaching, but I really wasn't thinking in terms of a bigger thing. But she had faith in me and said, you could go for bigger things. And that's why I did my first book, The History of the Snowman. This is the first museum that I love. This is the Museum of Natural History. And for a lot of people, their first memory of a museum is being brought to this museum as a child and walking in that room and seeing that enormous whale. This was inspired by the museum. Feels like we've been standing here for 200,000 years. I remember in the museum as a kid being able to wave and taunt the grizzly bears and stuff. And even though I was only 10 feet away from them, they wouldn't attack me. I grew up in the South Bronx, and there were three men who were very important to my life. These two and my dad, who I couldn't fit in this rowboat. But I grew up in Altaboy at Holy Cross in the projects. And so religion played a big part in my life and in my early work. And it reappears often in my cartoons. Here's an example of a cartoon. This is Moses coming down a ski lift. I did cartoons and illustrations for a long time for America Magazine, which is the largest Catholic magazine in the world. When I was a kid, actually, I learned how to work and paint by hand painting army men. I would actually paint hockey uniforms on all my military men, sort of a subconscious anti-military message. We found this in your brain. This is an example of including one of my doctors in a cartoon and later to exchange it for payment. And now, as a kid, the only cartoons really I read was Peanuts. That's supposed to be Charlie Brown. But I went to art school in Brooklyn, Pratt Institute, on a tennis scholarship. And I quickly developed a real appreciation for the masters and great art, and sort of absorbing and taking in as many shows and museums as I could. This is one of the rooms at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the story I tell in the book that's on this page, I'm going to paraphrase. It's a story told to me by one of my favorite New Yorker cartoonists, Mick Stevens. And Mick Stevens had the dream of one day having one of his paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So he schemed to put his painting on the wall. He has a whole thing that's sort of like the opposite of the Thomas Crown affair, and found a way of hanging his piece on the wall. It only lasted a few hours before the whole museum shut down and all the guards went rushing around. And luckily he was not caught, and he doesn't know whatever happened to that horrible painting he had somehow snuck on the walls of the Met. This is one of the highlights of the museum. It's a beautiful stained glass masterpiece on the ground floor in one of the courtyards. I always think the museums are not hoarding, but they're great giant selfies of ourselves. They're collections of everything we've accomplished on this planet put together. I want to mention too, I got into cartooning much later. It was just a dare. I was invited to the famous New Yorker lunch for my birthday. I happened to know the people there, and they invited me. And on a dare, they said, you should come back. You seem to, enjoy the meal and you like our company. We'd love for you to come back, but come back with some cartoons. So I did just that. And then I got myself stuck into this sort of cycle of cartoons. But I'm always into snowmen because I thought that it was one of the great mysteries. And so you'll see that I actually made that the topic of my first book. I decided I wanted to do some mystery. I was a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. So it could have been like, who told the first joke, or who made the first sandwich. I decided who made the first snowman. And I decided to travel around the world for 7 years, and using the expertise of experts like art historians and professors of cultural history. They helped me piece together the story of when man first made snowmen. So I'm going to go quickly through this part just to highlight some of the other things I've done. I am making a movie based on this book that was very beloved. This is the world's tallest snowman. It's 12 stories high. This is the popular thing in Japan. What you do is you make a cavity in your snowman and you place a candle. And this is a snowman festival. And this was the book that had the collection. And I started my own museum with this. It's not a real museum, but I like to think of it as one. I have the world's largest collection of snowmen at over 800 items. And there were times in which it actually overtook my life because I would have everything on display. I will share an example of those days when you couldn't move anywhere in my house without running into snowmen. But it was a serious endeavor. The snowman story really is filled with these skeletons. This is one of the bloodiest events in early American history, when Fort Schenectady was attacked by French soldiers and Indians from Montreal. And the guards, instead of standing their place, had made 2 snowmen in there where they're supposed to be. So the snowman has kind of a weird history of violence and other things. There's the miracle of 1511 and stuff like that. So I had hired scholars also to help me translate diaries from the Middle Ages to learn all that. But let's get back on course. This is a castle from New Mexico. And I had a great time painting this. Again, my objective when painting something this complicated is to have the foreground and the focal point be detailed, but make the background as loose as could be without losing any of its mood or proper feeling that I'm trying to convey. So if you look closely to the background, you'll see it's very loose. It's only in the foreground that I have like the details. It's all about light and color. As I learned, as I'm more experienced as a painter, and less to do with details and line or how accurate it is. It's up to me to make something as beautiful as I can and not be married to the photograph, but just use the photograph as an inspiration. Here we have the story at this castle in which boys were defending the castle. The soldiers were very young. And before the castle was overtaken by the enemy, the last of the young soldiers had leapt off of the castle to his death, wrapped in the Mexican flag. This museum is also known for being the set for William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. And earlier before that, it was used in a war film starring Gary Cooper and Burt Lancaster. This is actually in my neighborhood. This is down the street from where I live in New York City. It's the Cloisters, which is part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and follows the other castle because that's what this is. This was 4 castles that were taken from France, brought over to the Rockefeller estate in the northern point of Manhattan, and then pieced together to create this master castle, which is beautifully furnished, with all these artifacts from the Middle Ages and all these medieval gardens. And it's just amazing. I live down the street from it, and I come here, or I used to come here all the time to work. I would work on my New Yorker cartoons in the courtyard, and I would make this my office. The Rockefellers wanted to preserve the whole beauty of the experience of going to the Cloisters. And what they did was they had purchased 13 acres of land across the Palisades on the other side of the Hudson River in New Jersey, so that when you're at the Cloisters, your view was unobstructed without any buildings or any development, but all you saw was the beautiful Palisades. A few years ago, right before COVID, there was a company that was going to come build corporations right on that Palisades. And I got involved by writing op-eds and contacting senators to help block that building from happening. And I was successful in that. And I feel very proud that I helped preserve the beauty of the Cloisters. So this is a book in, I think, Japanese. It's my New York Times bestseller, Footnotes from the World's Greatest Bookstores. This is the book that inspired my book on museums. It was very successful, and I wanted to do something similar. And during COVID, I was reading how museums were struggling and how they needed more visitors, and financially, they really needed help. So I thought that my book would be, well, there's 2 reasons I did my book. One is I wanted to raise awareness, and also because it really was a dream job. I got a chance to see as much artwork in 2 years as most people do in a lifetime. So I feel like I did 2 really great things, and hopefully people will go out and visit museums. I'm going to share here like one example of how I work. This is a drawing of one of the bookstores from my book. Is actually in Argentina. It was an old opera house that was converted into a bookstore. And sort of for the sake of this little short, knowing that I was going to share how I work, I wanted to also add a little fireworks. And I hope that comes across here, that it's kind of exciting to see how the picture sort of develops. Like the museum book, the bookstore I had done hundreds of different bookstores with only half of them being used. In the museum book, I actually went to more than I would use, and I researched about 150 museums. And what I did was I narrowed it down to the best 75. In this case, the stage became a cafe. The old opera boxes were actually where people could take their books and read. So let's go back to museums. One of my favorites is another one that's not far away, is the Mark Twain House and Museum, and that's in Hartford. The story in that museum, one of the stories has to do with the fact that employees have been saying that they found ghosts, and they say that the museum is haunted. I'm actually going to be doing an event here in June talking about museums in the area again, but I'm going to go into more specifics about this museum. But I'm also going to talk about humor, because Mark Twain is one of our great humorists. So it'll give me a chance to discuss humor on that level. I'm going to be doing it virtually on Zoom, not in person. But that's not because I'm afraid, because the museum's haunted. Like here, they feel they'll reach more people if it's done virtually. And we can get to questions soon. I'm going to bring up that this is one of the books I did, a cat name book. I encourage you to ask me any questions about publishing. If you want to, you could scan this if you have a QR reader, and this will get you to my website. And if you want to, you can get to my newsletter. My newsletter is filled with cartoons and humor, and I try to share writing advice, not just from me, but from people who are really good, who are people I learned from. Everything I'm sharing now, I've learned from other people and other teachers, and I want to share that with other people. And that includes humor and cartoons and things like that. And so if you just put your screen, your phone screen to this symbol, you should be able to get that. And let me share a couple of more doodles I did from museums. This is from the Smithsonian Institute. And are there any questions? I can answer some questions while we look at some more of the drawings.
Sure. Des asks, have you been to the JP Morgan Museum or the library in Manhattan?
I did. I love them. And I've worked there before. And I just did a piece about them in LitHub magazine. And you could find that by just going to lithub.com and Googling my name. The JP Morgan Library is where I did a lot of research for my snowman book. And I was sorry that they're not in this museum book. I really had to pick the very most interesting museums and the best. So there was a lot of great museums that were left out. And my hopes is that I could do a sequel and include some of these great museums. But there was also the problem that I had included a few museums from New York City already. And I wanted to really be diverse. I really want to include museums from across the whole country and all of North America and Canada and Mexico. And so I was getting a little top heavy from New York City. But that's a great suggestion. And if you do visit New York City, I would definitely add it to your to-do list to visit that library.
Okay. So as you show more pictures of your cartoons, which are beautiful, by the way, Ellen asks, out of all the museums that you visited, do you have a favorite? And if so, why?
Ellen, I have so many favorites. I'll tell you today, I'm looking at the Mass Mocha one, and I'm thinking, That's the one that I walked away, like I was moved, like I was like so stunned, and I had to regroup to get back into my own work, thinking I'm totally worthless. Because you have to remember, I'm seeing all these masters, and then I'm supposed to be doing these paintings. I'm thinking, oh, who am I to be doing this work? I've been seeing the best work in the world. But Mass Smoker was such a weird experience and so wonderful, and I can't wait to go back there again. But if you ask me tomorrow, Ellen, I would say the Cloisters is my favorite museum, or the Peabody Essence Museum, which we didn't share here, but it's also another museum that's close by to where you are if you're coming from the Ashland Library community. That museum specializes in maritime stuff, and they have also reconstructed a Chinese house that they shipped brick by brick from China to this museum. It was given as part of a cultural exchange. And that museum was reconstructed to duplicate and be exactly the way it was in that Chinese village. And I'm not describing it as well as I should. I'm not giving it justice, but trust me, if you get a chance to go to the Peabody Museum and go.
I am having trouble with my Zoom in general, so please be patient with me. Ian asked a question, how long have you been visiting museums?
Well, it started when I was like about 7 years old, and I was dragged kicking and screaming down to Washington, D.C., where my mom was determined to educate us. And we had to read all the plaques in these museums of Washington, D.C. It was the most boring experience. And I, like so many other kids, the first experience in a museum was a negative one. And I never could have imagined I would one day love museums, but my first museums was back then. But then I went to the American Museum of Natural History. I started appreciating art. And so I've been going to museums really my whole life, as long as I can remember. And for this project specifically, I began going to them in earnest about a year and a half ago, in which I planned a itinerary, a car trip, exactly where I was going to go with different places, and where people were meeting me at the museums. They would often close the museum early or open it early, and I would get a personal tour and get a one-on-one with the curator. Not every museum story was like that. They were all case by case. But I had also all these museum stories from other people and myself before this book even began. So I hit the ground running.
Wow. So I want to bring that, ask a follow-up question to that, because in your introduction to the book, you wrote that you went when you were 8 years old to the Natural History Museum. It didn't sound like the best experience. So at what point did you start liking and appreciating museums?
It all depends on what you're looking for. I remember seeing like all the sea animals at the Museum of Natural History, but then museums took on a different shape and form as I got older. Um, there's this beautiful museum in Baltimore called the American Visionary Museum. And that is artwork like the one I'm showing on the screen here. That's just defies categorization, and it's work done by outsider artists and people who are not traditionally trained. And so all of a sudden, the art became anything you could do. See, once I felt less intimidated that the art is something I couldn't do myself or couldn't understand, it became more accessible. And once the artwork seemed like something that was not talking down to me, but was at my level, it became a whole different thing.
Mhm.
And now I feel like, well, like everything is different. Every time I go to a museum, it's not only going to be different from museum to museum, that I'm going to have exposure to something that I haven't seen before, but I can go back to the same museum and have a different experience. Because one thing I learned throughout these couple of years too is that they're very organic. Museums are constantly changing and they're evolving. And so I can go back and have a totally different time at a museum and learn something else I could never imagine. and see something that I thought I would have seen the first time.
Wow. That's amazing because I know that you went to visit up to 3 museums a day while you were researching this book. So how do you keep excited about what you're doing?
It was always exciting. The problem I had was I didn't want to forget.
Uh,
I distinctively remember going to the Fine Arts Museum in Boston and not wanting to go to another museum to overlap that memory. I was afraid that I would forget and that I wouldn't really totally well, it was too good a thing. There was so many good museums. It was never a time of fatigue per se. It was just a worry that um, I didn't want to leave. It's like going to a great concert
mhm.
and you just don't want to hear another concert. You don't want to hear any more music because you want to be left with this magical memory that was left in your head. I really felt that way. I was moved sometimes to tears when I would see artwork that was so beautiful. And if anybody knew me like 20 years ago, they would say, that's not you, that's not you. You don't do that, that you don't care about art. But I learned to love art. The more I was exposed to it, the more I found myself totally entrenched by it. And it just became something that I saw differently. You kind of acquire taste, and you learn to look at things differently. I
Yeah,
hope
and
that makes sense.
it seems like the more museums you went to, the more you wanted more.
Yeah, I'm finished with the book. The book is over, and I want to go back. I don't want it to end. I feel like I rushed, and now I just feel like now that I'm not working, I want to go back to those places.
Mhm.
And it was a lot of work, by the way. I did about 175 illustrations. Not everyone's in the book because, again, I had the luxury of picking the best. What I would do is I would really try to make sure there was no clunkers in the book. And the book is not perfect. The book is the best that I could do. I really gave it my all, working very long hours and redoing things and everything. I just gave my whole heart and soul into this book.
Mhm. Well, from all of your books, it seems like you have as well. In fact, Des asks, was T.S. Eliot an influence for you in your naming the naming the cats book?
No, the cat book was something totally different. And there's by no means is this book in that category. That book was for friends who were suffering during COVID and needed a laugh. And it just so happens all these friends of mine, a lot of them had cats. And I just decided, I try to think of an idea of how do I engage all these people to distract what they were going through. I mean, I feel like part of my job description is to provide a distraction, to be an entertainer in a way, but also communicate. And I don't communicate well as a speaker, but I do through the page. I really do feel like when it comes to doing something on the page, that's my wheelhouse. And all of a sudden now I feel like I can provide that distraction I want to give. And
Mhm.
when it came to the cat book, I said, I'm going to tell everyone they're going to help me with the book, and everyone's got to tell me their suggestions for great cat names. Because if one person did it, it could never come out complete. So what I did was I just sent out surveys, and everyone had a ball. People were locked up in their house, and they would send me back a list of like 100 cat names. And I combined them all, came up with cartoons, and it's a goof. The whole thing is just to have fun and just to be a distraction. Whereas a book like this or a book like the bookstores, I really do believe it's something that's a message that we don't take for granted, this institution that we have.
Mhm.
And not just the institution of bookstores and museums, but the institution of the written word in books. I feel too much people are now buying books as an ebook. And so I wanted to create something that really would be you would be depriving yourself of the enjoyment if you don't have the tactile experience of holding up a physical book
Mhm.
and really being one-on-one with the book. And if you could do more books like this, I think it would help the industry where people feel like it's about having the book and having that special relationship with that object.
Mhm. Well, I think your next book should be about libraries. The Ashland Library is actually a Carnegie library, and you should come and visit sometime. And
I will.
you should. We would have a blast.
We don't have to wait for there to be a book. I could definitely go there and do a little drawing and painting of the library.
Oh, you heard it all here, people. We're gonna make that happen. It's been recorded too, Bob, so you're in. Okay, I have a couple of questions about your process. Deborah and Harry asked if you use pen and ink and or watercolor, but I also want to know from in that question, when you left a museum, did you take pictures and then go back and do your drawings, or how did that work? And then what was the medium that you used?
Well, for the book, I had to use digital art, in which I used a welcome tablet with drawing. Now, I use traditional work as well, and I do sketches, and I have done regular oil paintings, and actually they look the same. I'm able to do oil paintings, and when I work now, it's about the same. So the reason why I do it digitally is for logistics. Because I'm doing so many, to do 100 or so canvases, it's just not practical, because a lot of them also, have to be scanned, and then I have to add the text to it, which is, it's handwritten. It's not a font by computer, but it's handwritten. But I've also got to be able to do layers in which I could change it for different languages. For instance, the bookstore book is in like 6 different languages. So I had to be flexible regarding the files. And because of the turnaround, I work digitally. It's easier for me that way. The other question was, what was the other question? Did I answer it?
So
The process, you asked. You asked if I take photographs of the place. It's kind of case by case. There were times in which I could do a little bit of it there, and I would draw actually there. But most of the time, I would take all the photographs, let it sink in, and then I would say which seems to be the best. But most of the time, what I did was I combined photographs. Like I would see a part of the museum, add it to here, make sure I took out all the things like wires and cars and different things like that. There might be an observer in a picture that's perfect, but the background wasn't. So I would take that museum goer and plop them in the perfect picture. So everything was like sort of the best of the best. And then I would combine it to one nice picture that I thought worked best.
Mhm.
It was always my intention to give a museum its best foot forward. That was like my job, is to give it like the best look. So people really said, oh, I want to go there.
Mhm. Well, what I loved about it was you had these beautiful pictures, but you also had these stories about them that you don't hear just walking through and looking at the pictures. So you really delved into the background stories, which was really wonderful. If you get to read this book and hold it in your hands, you'll love it. Olga asks, is there a museum you wish existed?
That's a tough one. For 37,000 museums in just North America alone. So if I come up with a suggestion, it's probably there already. I'm gonna try to think of this. I would say like maybe the Comedy Museum, and there is one. There's the National Comedy Center in Jamestown, New York. Let me think about this. I think I would like to see a snowman museum. There's only one in my living room.
Have you been to the ice cream museum in New York? The Museum of Ice Cream?
Yes, but something like that falls into the category of like the Museum of Sex, and there's all these other museums that are kind of monetizing the idea. They're a little bit more touristy. For instance, it's like a museum for almost every food product.
Yeah.
But it needs to be like a real museum that does something that's a little more than just sort of take advantage of people. It was really something on my mind to make sure that families got a good value if I recommended the museum,
Mhm.
that they would get something out of it. And that being said, I'll make a note that a lot of the museums in Washington, D.C. are free.
Mhm. Yep.
But I also picked museums that I felt did something for the community, they did something historically, they gave back. A lot of these museums had reach out programs, and they educate and they do other things that are well beyond what they needed to do.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so I really try to shine a light on those museums that were really making an effort to educate people and so forth. And a lot of museums participate in programs in which, if you belong to a certain group of financial problems, you have free passes. They give free museum passes to people who might not otherwise afford it.
Mhm. Yeah, you know that for everybody listening, that a lot of libraries have discounted museum passes. We have maybe 8 or 10 for local museums, so including the
That's
Isabella Stewart
great.
Gardner Museum. Yeah, so you can get almost 50% off, sometimes 50% off for a family of 4 to go to some of these museums. So definitely check your library as well to be able to go as many as you can.
Yeah. I want to ask you, what is your favorite museum? Or if anybody wants to tell me their favorite museum and put it in the Q&A, I'm going to open up my Q&A. I'm going to take a look.
Okay. My favorite museum is the Norman Rockwell Museum out in, it's not in Worcester, I think it's in Springfield. I just love Norman Rockwell. I don't know why.
I spoke there twice, and I think I want to say they're actually are they in Stockton?
Yes, yes. So they're just like in Western Mass, and it's just a beautiful, wonderful museum.
It is, but that's also very specific to a certain style. I liked a lot of the museums where it kind of covers all different things. So there's something for everyone. Because if you go with a family or something, you want to know that, let's say, if you go to the Museum of Natural History, they now have a section where there's live butterflies for kids, where you go in and there's thousands of butterflies swarming around you, which personally for me is actually scares me.
Okay. So do you know of any museums that are for cartoons or cartoonists?
The Billy Ireland Museum in Dayton, Ohio, or no, Columbus, Ohio. And the reason why that museum is not in the book is because it didn't quite meet all the criterias of some of these great museums. It was very much a one note thing. An example would be the Bob Dylan Museum in Nashville. So there's some museums that I thought were such a one note that I thought it was unfair to neglect others. I mean, the truth is if it was up to me, this book would not be published. I would still be working on it, and it would be a 10-volume book, and it would be like 700 museums. But my publisher said, we have to stop. Not only do we have to stop, we want you to do half the museums because we want to make this book affordable. And the best thing to do is to make the book within reason. We try to keep a price point, and we try to make the book as low as could be, affordable as could be. The book is listed at $27. And a lot of times you go into a bookstore now, a book is like $35.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why that was tricky is the book is full color. So it had to be printed full color. So we did the best we could. And the one thing we had to do is say, we're going to stop it at 75 museums. It's a fair amount. And we also didn't want people to be fatigued.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't want to overwhelm people. There's always a chance in the future. I'm seeing some of the questions. Is it okay if I just tackle some of them really quick?
Absolutely. The longer
right.
the day, the happier we are.
Okay, what book has made you laugh the hardest? Norm MacDonald's memoir. Where and when is the Zoom at the Mark Twain house? I don't know exactly, but if you go to my website, it's June 26th at 7:00. But if you go to my website, you'll see some of the events. As a matter of fact, if anybody wants to get my newsletter and they sign on today for free, I'll upgrade you to the paid version, which is not important to most people. But if you are a writer or a cartoonist, you might like that because I give them more of a deep dive of instruction.
Okay.
Have you ever written any children's? I'm sorry.
I'll send a
I was
link.
going to go to the next one. Please.
I'll send out a link to everybody who's registered to your website to sign up.
Okay, thank you very much. Gary Cooper gay, that was only a rumor going around, but fashionable men in these ads and stuff. There was always that type of rumor, and they called them bachelors back then. And I've seen a lot of really great gay illustration shows, because that was a thing of illustrating and doing codes within the illustration. There would be codes to say that. The fascinating world, and some really talented artists. What are you working on now? I'm doing a book now on great writers who are inspired by their cats. And I'm doing a portrait of all these different people, including Margaret Atwood and Joyce Carol Oates and George Plimpton, Ernest Hemingway. And it's a really fun piece. I grew up in the Bronx. Where did you go to high school? I went to high school in Patchogue Medford High School in Long Island, but I went to grade school at Holy Cross Elementary School. And then I went out to Long Island by the time I was in high school. Robin, where did you go to school in the Bronx? Any comments about the National Museum of American Illustration in Newport? It's amazing. That's the museum that had the show about the gay illustrators that I loved in New York City. They had a show. I stayed overnight at the museum. They had invited me, and they're asking me to go back in the summer to speak. It's a beautiful collection, but it's closed right now, and it won't be reopened until the second part of summer. If you check my newsletter every so often, I'll make an announcement when it finally opens. But if you're in Newport and you can't go to that museum, a beautiful museum is the Tennis Hall of Fame.
Huh. Cool. I have to say, Bob, that you know the heart of a librarian. I mean, books and cats. You got us.
With your book about bookstores, how many of them still exist? I would say about 90 to 95% of the bookstores still exist. There's about 3 or 4 from my book who unfortunately closed down. I have heartbreaking stories of letters I got from people whose stores closed and what the book meant to them and the rough times they had. And we won't end on a sad note, but we'll move on to the next one. Can you talk about this cartoon of the man with flowers? That's an illustration by an installation artist named Nick Cave. Nick Cave is a very important artist in the country whose work can be enjoyed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Peabody Museum of Art, and a lot of major museums have featured him. And he's just fantastic. Oh my God, is he fantastic. He includes music with his installations. So please look up Nick Cave, not Nick Cave, the famous musician who happens to be friends with my wife, but the artist. Okay, what is a Carnegie Library? Louise, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
I can answer that. And so many people in the chat can answer that too, because there's a lot of librarians here. Basically, the Ashland Library was first built by money donated by Andrew Carnegie. He was a huge supporter of libraries, museums, and things like that. And we're one of the 2,500 libraries that he donated to that are still in existence as a library. We were built in 1904. So there's not many Carnegie libraries left, but he supported a lot of organizations.
Oh, thank you for explaining that. You mentioned that, but I didn't understand it, but thank you. What's the furthest you traveled for one of your pieces? Well, I've been to the museums in England and in Europe and to Iceland. For this book, I did go all the way to the West Coast. I went up and down all the West Coast museums the best I could. And Jody says she lives in LA and says the Met is the best. But Jody, please go to the Museum of Jurassic Technology and also go to the Broad. The Broad, I'm sure you went already. The Broad is just an amazing experience as a state-of-the-art museum that has things that no other museum has. So the Broad, and that's featured in my book.
So if I was to just name a town in the US somewhere, you could come up with a museum probably that we could see within an hour.
No, I should know it, but I'm getting older. I'm old. When I went to school, I have this really tired joke that when I went to school, we didn't have history class. It was current events. And if you gave me a beat, I could give you a museum, but I couldn't do it off the top of my head because I have to refresh my memory. As a matter of fact, when I was giving this talk, I sometimes, took a beat to remember what I wanted to say because of that. And part of that's because not only are there the museums in this book in my head, but all the other museums. And remembering the location of 150 museums and the details of each of the museums, it's sort of like scrambled all over the place. So I do need a minute to sort of sort out what I wanted, which museum is which.
Mhm.
Have you been to the Museum of Instruments in Arizona? I heard about it, but it was a little bit of a narrow focus, and I did not go there. I know this sounds terrible, but when I chose museums for music, a museum like Graceland has so much more emotional importance to a lot of people that, as important as a museum about musical instruments is, that was one that should go in the sequel.
We're expecting.
There's a lot of wonderful outdoor sculpture museums. Did you go to any of them? I believe the best one to go to would be Storm King in upstate New York. But if you're on the West Coast, of course, you want to go to the Getty Center. The Getty Center, I thought, may be the best in regards to outdoor sculpture.
Okay.
You've mentioned tennis twice. Are you a player? I didn't finish high school. I had a friend of mine who taught me tennis in high school. He went on to be a pro. I went on to be a ranked player. And because of him, I not only got into college on a tennis scholarship, but because of him, I met my mortal enemy, who I later married for revenge.
Okay, did
So
you take her to
tennis was a
Iceland when
big
you went
part
to
of my life.
Did you take your mortal enemy who became your wife to Iceland when you just had to go there for museums?
We went to the Penis Museum in Iceland in Reykjavik on our honeymoon.
They really do have a museum for everything.
They do have it. I'm only saying that to make that point. The Blue Museum in the Adirondacks, which has many actual items from the history life of the museum. Mary Jo, of course, that's in the museum book. That's one of my favorite memories. And I would go up there more often if it wasn't for the black flies.
Black flies, bad.
They're a little bit rough.
Okay, I think we've gotten to most of the major questions. What do you think?
I just want to thank everyone for your patience. You're doing me a favor. You're allowing me to talk about something I love myself and museums and all these other things. I really do enjoy talking to this group about this because it's what I've devoted the last, years doing. And it's my life's work. And it gives me a chance to share what I learned. And I just want to say, I hope everyone has a great summer. And if you do get the book's in libraries and it's in other places as well as any bookstore. I hope you use it as a bucket list to maybe go to some museums that you heard of, but you never had a chance to go to.
Yes, thank you all for being here. All right, I got my get kicked out one last time.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. Bob, thank you. This has been fantastic. Much more than I ever expected. And I expected a lot. So appreciate your time and your humor and your art.
No, thank you. And let's please keep in touch. You have, if you could get to my newsletter, you can ask me questions I didn't answer, and I could ask you questions. And I really enjoy this. So please, everyone, have a great summer and thank you.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Good night. And this time I'm leaving on purpose.